and ask for the election, has a cup of tea, as they say. I don't know if they have coffee, decaf, I'm not sure what they'll want to drink. With the Governor-General, he will then make the drive. There usually is a period of time. Let's just go through how the sausage is made, Fran. There's a period of time, not long, and then the Prime Minister will speak and make his pitch.
He'll speak in the Prime Minister's courtyard. The journalists are all there waiting, and then he'll give us the pitch. As you say, will it be who do you trust? It's kind of that kind of message, or don't risk, I think, is perhaps what we're going to hear more of. I imagine we'll hear Anthony Albanese's name mentioned a few times, as Gareth said, which is a little unusual. But yeah, that's the process, and that'll happen probably mid-morning, or a little later, towards noon, and then off we go.
And so, Gareth, that will be quite a key moment. It's the beginning of the campaign. The campaigns are very set. They practice this, the key messages. Will Scott Morrison's main mantra be, don't take the risk?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that that is the main message. It's like, well, look at what we've been through. And you saw it in the campaign ad that was released last night. Oh, well, look, you know, we had imperfect information, or we didn't get everything right. There's almost a hint of the apology there. Look, we did our best, you know, we didn't get everything right, but, you know, we've learned a lot, and we've got through it together, and the pandemic was really tough, and
how good is Australia?
The economy's great, and how about those young kids putting their hands up to run small businesses, and, you know, I'm sort of Captain Australia. So I think that very much will be the pitch, and I know that they are very keen to invite that comparison, as I said earlier. That's really what this is going to be about. It'll be compare the pair, lest I use the M-word, marketing, almost like a shopping list and a consumer-oriented campaign. Who do you prefer? What are the features? What's the price tag?
Now, we've messed with the format a little because the Prime Minister landed in Canberra to call an election, so that's fair enough. I haven't, smashed the program. David, it'll be fine for you next week. No, he's watching. He will be back.
He'll be watching.
He'll be watching. But certainly, we've unfortunately not able to bring you talking pictures with Mike Bowers. We will have it on iView, though. It's an excellent segment, so please look for it on iView. We will shortly cross to ABC News coverage of the unfolding day, the election 2022 being called. But I think final observations make sense about now, Fran.
Final observations. In the last week, last few weeks really, and amongst all that's been trailing out in this faux campaign, the government has been releasing refugees who have been in detention in various hotels around the country. Some of them have been in detention for 8-9 years, but the Medivac, those who came here on the Medivac process, they've been let out in dribs and drabs. The last 8 got out of that park hotel in Melbourne just on Friday, I think. There's been some analysis, commentary around why they're doing that. Is it because they're in a campaign trying to get the barnacles off, as John Howard might say? So I'm wondering whether Alex Hawke, who's the Immigration Minister, will take that big step and finally give the Billa-Wheeler family a visa and allow them to go back to Billa-Wheeler.
Interesting. Gareth?
Tangney, held by Ben Morton, the Special Minister of State and Prime Minister's right-hand man, is not a target seat for Labor, but they're certainly keen to cause trouble there. Labor's candidate is a former West Australian policeman, Sam Lim, with Chinese Malaysian heritage, has excellent contacts into those multicultural communities in that seat, in part because of the work he did during COVID as a WA police liaison. Now, a Labor person told me yesterday that he did a fundraiser this week with 1,000 people donating $1,000. And this Labor person said, sorry, $1,000 or $100? No, $1,000.
It's a lot of money.
They want to get Ben Morton off the plane and back into his electorate.
OK, Jennifer, final word.
Well, the last election we had, during the last term of government rather, we had an economy that performed far better than anybody expected. No matter who wins government this time, the economy is going to be a much harder ask even than it has been, mainly because of the imported geopolitical problems, which are not just geopolitical risk and politics and wars, but also great economic risks and inflation.
Well, that's it for Insiders, but stay with the ABC for ongoing coverage as the Prime Minister heads to Government House to call the election. And we will be crossing, of course, to that coverage. Greg Jennett and Jane Norman will bring you that coverage. But we'll leave you with Anthony Albanese's kind offer. Now, he was very much this week pushing the Prime Minister to call the election, and it was quite a moment where he messed up exactly where Government House was. But we're now throwing to Greg Jennett and Jane Norman, who take over to bring us the ABC coverage of election 2022. Thanks for watching.
PK, thanks so much for a program that straddled live and breaking news as well as reflections on the last week. Welcome to our live and continuous coverage from Parliament House of a momentous day in Australian democracy.
Yeah, Greg, Scott Morrison's about to do what's been done 46 times by 29 predecessors since Federation, which is to call on the Governor-General to order an election that'll be held in May. In the hours ahead, we'll track the Prime Minister's movements, his visit to Government House, and then the opening statements from him and Labor leader Anthony Albanese, and much more too.
Much more, I think, Jane. All this before the two leaders actually hit the road. Will that be today or tomorrow? We're not quite certain. Crisscrossing the nation with their respective campaigns to convince voters that they, and they alone, deserve the chance to lead the government of Australia for the next 3 years. Now, as PK was just noting, Jane will probably be giving a bit of a geography lesson of Canberra throughout the morning because there's a bit of ground to cover. In previous coverage, we had the Prime Minister landing at the Fairbairn RAF base at Canberra Airport. That's the military side. And there's a little bit of a black hole before we'll start to see him on Adelaide Avenue.
Yes, that is right. So he'll head from Adelaide Avenue down to Dunrossell Drive and to the government, to Governor-General, really, to call this election. But Greg, I mean, there's been such a lead up to this day. Every day the question has been, will he or won't be he? But I guess it's no great surprise that today is the day he's calling the election.
No surprise whatsoever, Jane. In fact, I think he was probably growing mildly annoyed at the persistence of journalists asking each and every day, are we there yet? Are we there yet? But finally it came. And the logic behind this day is pretty compelling when you look at it. Had he not gone today, then you would have had MPs back on planes themselves by this afternoon to make their way for what was a pre-scheduled sitting of Parliament to start tomorrow.
And it would have been, I mean, almost kind of crazy to have the 151 members of the lower house and 70 or so senators coming back to Canberra only for the election to be called. So we are hearing from sources that when Scott Morrison visits David Hurley, he will be asking him to set May 21 as the date of the election when Australians will go to the polls to choose who governs for the next 3 years. And that really sets up a 6-week-long campaign. Greg, often we have a sort of a 5-week campaign. This is extending out to about 6 weeks. Are we to read much into the longer campaign? Yeah,
41 days, and we believe he is, going for the 21st. But you've got to subtract from that, Jane, a raft of public holidays that fall over the next few weeks. So 4 days over your Easter weekend. That doesn't mean that it cancels out formal campaigning, but it will slow it down.
Yep.
And then you've got Anzac Day following. So that may have factored into his calculations, the loss of effectively, 5 days or so more if you count the weekends around them. That may have been a factor. Or he simply thinks, I want to grind Anthony Albanese down slowly and relentlessly over the days ahead. Now, we are waiting for the Prime Minister to emerge along Adelaide Avenue, as we said, but why don't we jump it back to a little earlier, a journey that started at Kirribilli House this morning. Scott Morrison waking up there, he farewelled his wife Jenny at the doors and left in C1. The Com car, BMW 7 Series, armour and bullet plated. There are multiple versions of them, of course. That's not the one we're seeing in Canberra, or will very shortly. But that was the journey out of Sydney, and a flight that took about 35 to 40 minutes before he was able to land in the nation's capital, Jane.
Yeah, and he touched down at about 9:45. You can see there pictures of Scott Morrison with his bags. Of course, he, like all the journalists in this building, are about to embark on this 6-week campaign, saying goodbye to loved ones. And that's, of course, his RAF jet on the tarmac in Sydney, about to touch down, which it did about sort of 15 minutes ago. And here is vision of him landing in Canberra a short time ago. So he is making that drive as we speak to Government House to ask David Hurley, the Governor-General, to call the election. And we understand it will be on May 21. But Greg, as we heard a lot on Insiders, the lead up to this day has been anything but ideal, really, for the Prime Minister Scott Morrison. It hasn't been a particularly disciplined week within his ranks.
It hasn't, and from a media perspective, we dwelt on it heavily because there wasn't much else happening throughout the week. No doubt, in Scott Morrison's own mind, today marks a punctuation point at which he would hope, at least, some of the focus on Liberal Party infighting might dissipate, and he can set an agenda himself today when he eventually emerges in the Prime Minister's courtyard. That's to make his opening pitch to voters. So
we saw a bit of a hint actually last night, and this was, I think, the clearest signal yet that the election would in fact be held today, when a social media video emerged with Scott Morrison, a pretty slick video, tightly edited, where he started to really, as you say, draw a line in the sand of the past sort of messy week and start to focus voters' minds on the choice ahead of them at the coming election. And there are a few interesting parts of that video conceding that the government has got more than a few things wrong, but really focusing on the economic recovery from COVID, the comparatively low death rate, the very high vaccine rate. So I think it's clear that that is what he is trying to, you know, highlight to voters as they start to tune into politics.
Of course, and that's of a piece with the messaging that he's been trying, if not since the budget, then let's say since about February now. And if there's one thing we know about campaigning, it's repetition, repetition, repetition. So expect to hear a lot more on that. There is also a matching piece from Anthony Albanese, who has written himself an op-ed for News Corp papers, and there's an accompanying piece of video later on in our coverage, because there will be gaps for us to fill between the major moments. We'll bring you both of those video presentations from the respective leaders, but we were just a moment ago seeing some vision from outside the gates of Government House. There are a few protesters there. That is not unusual. In fact, there's been almost a constant presence by protesters around this place, Parliament House, and to some extent outside Government House now for several days. These are, what would you describe them as? Well, they're anti many things. They're anti-vax.
It's actually the same group that's always been here since around Australia Days. They've been sort of dipping in and out of Canberra, but yes, their list of gripes is very long and varied. Anti-vax, anti-lockdown. I mean, I suppose after the COVID pandemic, it's kind of, you know, we've seen groups come together to really rail against government intervention in their lives. And so it's not quite clear precisely what their united message is or what their objective is, but they're certainly making their presence known around Canberra. Yeah,
so long before we get to a shot outside Government House, we've already been flagging for you. We hope to show you C1 moving down Adelaide Avenue, which would in fact be past Parliament House and then past the Lodge as opposed to Government House. Just pointing that out for those who don't realise the respective role of both premises, the Lodge being the Prime Minister's house of recent years, but Government House is his destination. In the first instance today, we might bring in our political editor, Andrew Probyn, now as we wait for C1 to come out of the visual black hole that is the journey across the lake and around the marathon runners' probes and then on to Adelaide Avenue. She's going to be quite a contest that the Prime Minister triggers today.
This is going to be, it's a long contest. I mean, it's a long contest for, first and foremost because of those days lost to Anzac Day and Easter, as you talked about. But also it's a long contest because the government, the Prime Minister, starts behind. So he needs to, as much time as possible to catch Anthony Albanese. He wants the election on May 21 not to be the referendum on him, because if it is a referendum on Scott Morrison and the government, government will be lost to the coalition. He needs voters to hesitate at the ballot box. He needs voters to make a choice that does compare experience, the known versus the unknown. It was most striking, I think, in Anthony Albanese's own ad, and this is the presentation that the party puts to the public. He was introducing himself as Anthony Albanese. He was introducing himself as someone who has an economics degree, someone who has been infrastructure minister for 6 years or so. What does that tell you?
Well, does that tell us that something is biting? He feels it is necessary to respond to these provocations of the government?
Well, as Anthony Albanese said himself this week, there was a time many times during the pandemic that people were either tuned to an address to the nation or Married at First Sight. In fact, he said that Married at First Sight sometimes had been interrupted by the address to the nation. The opposition leader for most of the pandemic was actually the Premier's. And so he had a supporting role. He hasn't had the prominence that opposition leaders usually have. And so who is Anthony Albanese still is a question that they have to answer.
And so, both sides are trying to define him, right?
Exactly. Scott Morrison is going to be quick, and all of his colleagues are going to be quick to try and define Anthony Albanese for him. And because their tactic will be to make May 21 about choice.
So if you look at the campaigns, well, I suppose that the starting point of this campaign, all the published opinion polls put Labor well ahead of the coalition after preferences. I think it's about 54 to 45%. So that would show, well, that would, I suppose, reinforce to Labor that the campaign and the past 3 years of strategy from Anthony Albanese has been on the money, right? He's run an extraordinarily disciplined campaign. He hasn't been sort of tempted during COVID to make more of himself, given the catastrophic situation we found ourselves in. And he's run a very small target strategy. And that's kind of where we've landed.
Well, look, as he had suggested it would be, it is. And he had this plan set out back in 2019, before the pandemic, it must be said. So Anthony Albanese is a master strategist. He is very, very good at tactics, both parliamentary and in a political sense. And we're seeing some of what he had suggested would happen. The problem is, however, that he's perhaps been too much in the shadows. That said, I think that the Prime Minister starts with a ghastly stain on his character. If it is about his character, his standing with voters, that could put simply. And that is why this is going to be one of the most viciously personal campaigns we will have seen in recent decades.
I thought it was interesting that the PM has opted for a 6-week campaign, because clearly in 2019, the coalition saw that Scott Morrison was an asset. You know, they basically attributed the win to him and his campaigning, but he'd only been PM for less than a year. Now Scott Morrison enters this race with so much baggage from the past 3 years, but also, as you just pointed to, his character has been relentlessly under attack, and most damaging, under attack from those within.
Absolutely, he's been in the stocks for months. We've had a foreign president. We've had internal slaying of his character and personality. He's been called a liar. He's been called untruthful. We have a deputy prime minister, now Nationals leader, who has been quite unpleasant in his text messages about Scott Morrison. So it really is it's a lot of lead in the saddlebags for Scott Morrison. But what's his tactic? His tactic is, well, you might not like me, but at least you know me. Look at the other guy. This is why it becomes that very presidential contest. And of course, we don't vote for presidents in Australia, but the contest between the Labor leader and the leader of the Liberal Party is going to be first and foremost in that campaign.
Which means anyone who is standing by hopeful of a policy-rich contest of ideas, big concepts for the nation, programs to be rolled out for the next 3 years, they might be sorely disappointed.
Well, I think they will be disappointed because actually, if you're looking at the big vision, what is it that both sides of this contest are going to be bringing to the next term? It's very ill-defined. There is no big vision There is no big vision being. Sorry, I had a voice in my ear there.
From the control room, not just.
Yes, not any problems. But in terms of that big vision, what both sides will be bringing to the next side of the other side of this election, we have no idea. But what we do know is that the next government, whoever that is, will have to be dealing with some very, very big economic problems.
And I thought it was actually quite interesting in Anthony Albanese's op-ed this morning. Actually, we've just got some live shots there. We've got the C1 with Prime Minister Scott Morrison inside with his Chief of Staff, John Kunkel, we understand, heading rolling along Adelaide Avenue, very, very close to Government House in Yarralumla. For all of our viewers not in Canberra getting a geography lesson this morning.
They'll be hanging a left just to complete the geography lesson, hanging a left onto Cotter Road and a short journey before hanging a right, in fact, at traffic lights onto Russell Drive, and that's the tree-lined avenue that takes you right down to the gates of Government House, the official residence of the Governor-General, and that's David Hurley and his wife Linda. They live in a stately manner on 53 hectares of land there, and the shot you can see within our picture now is in fact the Cotter Road flyover, which means the Russell Drive element of the Prime Minister's journey is nigh upon him.
So, Greg, after Scott Morrison has his chat and perhaps a cup of tea with David Hurley, we then expect him to come back here to Parliament House, where he will deliver his press conference. He'll be questioned by journalists, and also really his first proper pitch to the nation. And Andrew Probyn, as you were just mentioning a moment ago, the economy, I mean, both sides are talking about the economy. We have the coalition talking up the massive recovery we've had since COVID. We've got, the C1 now, Prime Minister's car heading along Cotter Drive. So very, very shortly to make that journey into Government House. But just as we're saying on the economy, the PM's talking up the recovery. Don't risk the momentum we have now. And interestingly, on the Labor side, Anthony Albanese very much talking up sort of himself as a safe alternative, saying Labor will get spending under control. I will start paying down debt so I don't have to raise taxes.
The Prime Minister wants to talk about the recovery because he doesn't really want to talk about the debris that's been left behind because of the pandemic and the response to it. We have $1 trillion debt. We have deficits that are in the order of $80 billion for at least 2 financial years. There's no sign of surplus any time soon. And the bigger problem is that we actually have a budget in structural deficit right up until the 2030s. That means that we're effectively spending more money as a nation than we have in our pockets. And that is a big challenge for both sides of politics. But the economy is...
Why don't we just, but hold that thought, Probes, because it is an undulating, rolling set of hills down Russell Drive, and as he crests each rise, you will see the Prime Minister in C1 and associated motorcade rolling right down. And here is our aerial shot that will reveal to you the golf course on one side, well, in fact, on both sides these days, and Russell Drive as the Prime Minister rolls down there. What protesters there are will only be in the final 10, 20, 50 metres before the gate. There won't be enough of them to line the entire Russell Drive. There are ample police on site, evidently, to ensure that the Prime Minister is not interrupted, and he is only the first Prime Minister in 14 and a half years to have made this journey twice. It was John Howard in October of 2007 who had called for himself 4 elections. Didn't win that one, obviously, but no Prime Minister since. Not Rudd, not Gillard, not Abbott, nor Turnbull.
Which
ever
says a
got
lot,
to go
doesn't
twice.
it, about the 9 years of coalition power. 9 years, 3 Prime Ministers, and Scott Morrison is actually the longest served of all 3.
And it also is fascinating to look at his trajectory over those 3 years. He started with such immense authority over his party room, having won what was called the unwinnable election. And then you just saw in each year his popularity sort of wax and wane to now.
Yep, and they are just about to pull up to Government House. This is a relatively recent invention that we're able to have cameras right there and up this close. Once upon a time, you had to pull out a big zoom lens from a lookout a long way away. But it is a glorious autumn morning here in Canberra. Temperatures in the mid to high teens and the leaves already changing colour, beginning to fall as Scott Morrison alights from C1 to be greeted by the official secretary, the staff there, and that's John Kunkel wearing the glasses behind the Prime Minister. He's Chief of Staff for pretty much his entire Prime Ministership. Now, inside the door at Government House. How long, Jano? Normally 15 to 20 minutes tops?
Yeah, normally 15 to 20 to get the formalities out of the way. And then I guess it's anyone's guess as to when he'll make the journey back here to hold that press conference. Last time, I'm pretty sure back in 2019, it was about an hour between leaving Government House and actually getting here to Parliament House to hold that press conference. And I guess Andrew Probyn, when he does, what's his message going to be?
Stick with it. That's the central message, that there's a lot of uncertainty around. He'll cite the war in Ukraine. He will cite the recovery that still has to be cemented in, and he will also acknowledge the fact that the last few years have been difficult for him personally and for the country. But you at least know me, and that is the key message from Scott Morrison. It has been for weeks. It will be today, and we've got 6 weeks of it coming up.
All right. Look, we do have an opportunity to get some thoughts from Fran Kelly, who was, as we know,